In the face of an unpredictable future, we are all called upon each and every day to think of out-of-the-box ways to tackle challenges to our environment, well-being, or what to do when that fox shows up at your bedside demanding breakfast. Welcome to the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to these challenges and are here to share stories about their own personal journey towards making our world a better place. I'm your host, Peter Marcus Bach, a trained engineer, oftentimes wishful architect with a passion for connecting across expertise and providing you access to knowledge from the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. My guest today is Scott Lloyd, an architect and founding member of 10, an architecture research group based in Zurich, Switzerland. Scott has worked across the globe on projects around the theme of rapid urbanization and alternative housing, including countries like Switzerland, China, Australia, Nepal, and South Africa. His work has been widely featured at various international architectural exhibitions. Today on the show, we discuss the trending topic of cohabitation and the role of humans in cities and the broader landscape. We uncover Scott's penchant for myths and experimentation both in and out of the design studio and hear his take on the future of architecture and design. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining and please enjoy the show. All right, so welcome to the show, Scott, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Peter. I'm looking forward.
I'm very excited to be able to engage with you in some very interesting things that you've been doing in the field of architecture and urban design. And I know I'm a very aspiring architect, not that I can't draw to save my life.
I've never seen your drawings. So
no, but trust me, you don't want to. But I think architecture plays a very important role in shaping the places we live in and the environment we're around. And the work we've done together has been quite inspiring to me. So it's really nice to have you here and to have you share some of your experiences and your journey.
Yeah, thanks.
But I guess before that, one aspect that I found that was quite interesting when you told me a bit more about what you do in your free time or some of the things that you engage in. One of the aspects is myth busting. And I thought, well, myth busting, I thought of the show. But tell me a bit, what do you mean by myth busting? What kinds of myths are we talking about?
Well, I don't know about the show, actually, but the idea of myth busting, or the idea that looking at myths, understanding what myths do and how they are powerful and how they animate how we live and shape our motivations. I think looking further into them, understanding how they are put together, how they're built and how they're disseminated, it gives you an impression that these are stories and narratives that are built and agreed on between people. And that's all they are. They're intersubjective and they're very powerful things, but in the end, they're also myths. We could also change them and we can also adapt them. And I'm very much interested in thinkers and writers and practitioners, or scientists as well, and even designers who go beyond the given myth or the myth that we run on every day and find new perspectives and create new myths, or at least contribute to creating new myths.
Do you have a specific example of a particular myth that has been engaging you quite recently?
I mean, the heavy ones. I mean, the ones which I think, I sent you this book, Straw Dogs by John Gray. And the main myth there is the myth of humanity being in some way preeminent on the earth. You know, the idea, this is a Christian belief as well, and it sort of also underpins Western thought and the idea of progress of humanity. And this is something very hard to really take on. And as we were discussing before, when you read these things, and they're very well argued, and it's a string of thought throughout human history, that the human being is as vulnerable as other animals and is basically like another animal. And I think that's a myth which a lot of people still find it very difficult to believe. Now, let me put it another way. It's a myth they all believe in, and it's a myth they are very unwilling to consider a myth. They consider it to be fact. So this is something I'm interested in right now, the counter-enlightenment thought.
John Gray, I've been delving into that as per your recommendation. And yeah, really this idea that we're designing things, or I guess the mindset we have is very human-focused. We're seeing this a lot as well with this talk of the Anthropocene, that we're now in what we call the Anthropocene, and that humans have been consuming quite a lot of the Earth's resources, and we need to start to rethink about that. I guess that's the main message from Straw Dogs, isn't it? That's what I gather from the first bits that I've been reading. It's been a very insightful book, but it's quite not an easy read for someone who's also not very familiar with philosophy.
No, true. I mean, he's basically coming at the point where he's saying we have to rethink how we perceive ourselves in the world, and it will be healthy, and not only for ourselves, but also for the biosphere. And that's all coming to a point right now in a lot of discussions where it's becoming popular knowledge that we are in a bit of a crisis and heading towards an environment which we are, don't control. And it will influence how we actually are living, and it will influence human habitation.
It's actually interesting because people I talk to, they always bring up the saying, don't mess with Mother Nature. And yeah, you see this when we design our cities, we build our cities, and then a disaster comes through. It's tough to deal with. It's tough to recover from. And the mindset I see, at least in engineering, is trying to design infrastructure that is resilient to these kinds of disasters. In one area, I've heard the terms retreat, adapt, defend. And do you think this kind of mindset or this kind of philosophy is prevalent in other kinds of fields, like especially in architecture?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same with architecture, but I think it's fundamentally flawed to always be in that defensive position. And I think to be proactive and to say, well, our city is actually built properly. And I think what's not coming into conversation here is that the people who are most affected by these crises in cities are the most vulnerable. And the fact that this is moving on, at least a lot of philosophy around city planning and urban studies, is that you should be looking at the rights to the city. So those people who are actually living in these cities who are the most vulnerable don't usually have access to title. They don't have access to the right to build resilient housing for themselves. So instead of building back better, we should be looking at ways of increasing the rights of those who are actually vulnerable at the moment, and then plan our cities better. I think it's not a defensive position. It's more proactive and requires a lot more than just concrete and planning.
Very, very insightful points that you make there. And I think we often forget about governance in cities and the rights, the whole story about the rights to planning and who gets to decide what as well. But I guess we've gone pretty deep very quickly, but maybe taking a bit of a step back. So, I mean, you're a very interesting character with the experience that you've gained over the course of your career. You've worked in Switzerland, China, Australia, South Africa. You've helped set up a project in Nepal as well. Tell me a bit about where it all started in your journey. What's the origin story of Scott Lloyd?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it starts, as an adult, I would say it starts deciding to further my education and start in the field of architecture. But at the same time, I was considering art or engineering. And I think I fell somewhere in the middle because both of the schools, engineering and art, were either in the wrong locations or my portfolios for the art school didn't have the same requirements that I was studying for in the college. And the engineering school was too far away and it didn't fit into my life right then. So architecture school was the middle ground, and I'm kind of like very happy with that. And this was in Tasmania, in south of Australia. I mean, you were also in Australia for a while, right? So,
yes, I lived in Melbourne for 11 years.
So from Melbourne, where I was also born, we moved to Tasmania, and my father was doing a lot of various work. He was a financial consultant, a journalist, an entrepreneur. He was also moving around a lot, and we were also moving, obviously, with him. So the idea of having not a fixed location, not even a fixed identity. We're also not first-generation Australians. We're basically second generation, so we didn't grow up with the Australian culture. So being rather stateless in a sense, so I'm not having the feeling that I'm a national, allowed me that freedom to move and to also accept other cultures. Having two passports is also very handy to also see the perspectives, the deficits of your own country. And that gives you a bit of freedom to say, well, it's all relative. We can move around and we can try different locations and build lives up in different contexts. I guess that kind of comes across in my portfolio. It's incredibly mixed and has various locations around the world, has various sectors which I've been working in. I guess it comes from that position.
It's a very interesting thing that I can relate to as well, because I have two passports, grew up in Singapore, and then I came to Australia for my studies, and you went for architecture, I went for engineering. So I think the stereotype is either you're good at math or you're good at drawing. Well, I guess art is the extreme for that. But no, for me, it was also that case where I would have gone one or the other. And I faced similar decisions in that respect. And so Australia, in a way, started it off, but with that international mindset or that sense of I don't necessarily belong in a certain area. I have the opportunity to explore because I have that broad view, the two passports, kind of mentality. So where did that take you then, once you finished architecture, the first stage?
Yeah, so this was then I can't even remember the year, so I won't say it. It was sometime early 2000s. And I wanted to move out of Australia and experience Europe. And I came to Switzerland mainly because of the passport, to learn some German. Then I worked in various positions as art director in Zurich. And then decided to study at the ETH. Studying architecture at the ETH then gave me access to the network of the ETH and the broader themes that the ETH is dealing with, like this urbanization and some of the themes which are considered in urban studies to be the main challenges. I think the ETH departments, the research we were doing there, were really pushed that onto a global stage.
And your focus prior to that has been, so pardon my ignorance, but in the architecture studies, I guess you choose whether you focus at a building scale, a landscape scale, an urban scale. Is that quite well defined in your initial studies as an architect, or do you have a bit of everything and then you choose a specialization?
I think in general, the architects do a bit of everything. And there isn't, at least in Switzerland and either in Australia, there wasn't any specialization, either for landscape design, interior design, or urban design. It was basically you studied architecture, you got the feeling for where your passions lie and what scale you feel most comfortable with. And then things just evolve. And I think most of us are opportunistic in this way. We take on projects which are exciting and we know we can make a difference on. And so we jump into them. For me, straight after the master's degree at the ETH, I had the chance to work at the ETH on some really exciting projects, mainly in the informal settlement areas and the global city themes. And that was something which attracted me because, again, I wanted to be able to see what was outside of the architecture discipline. Because I think when you study at a good school like this, you're completely ready to go straight into industry and perform and to be efficient and to be a commodity in some company, right? But to hold off on that for a while or forever, it's good to stay at the university to work with these ideas and to share ideas and develop thoughts. And I think that's, at least that experimental field was attractive enough to keep me there for a while.
And so what I've noticed is that a lot of your themes around the time you spent at ETH was centered around urbanization. You had this urban think tank that you were part of, which I believe was also part of ETH's, your tenure at ETH. So how did you approach this idea of urbanization, knowing it's going to be, or it is an issue that we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of doing it. And I think at the ETH, we had the chance to test different approaches out. And I think what's so interesting about working at an institution like this is that you have various departments who are also willing to jump onto a project with you and explore from different perspectives. So applying different domains of knowledge to this similar problem, you come up with completely different solutions. And I think that's pretty fascinating. So we have those who are working on programming and developing algorithms. It's super interesting to work with them. We have sociologists who are working on questionnaires that we can work directly with people on the ground, and engineers who can help us then develop concepts on planning tools and various other novel devices. I think that's the most interesting thing. My interest in particular was that this theme of urbanization, and most particular of informal urbanization, when you look at the urban populations, what is not really talked about is that by 2050, almost half those urban populations are going to be living in some kind of informal settlement conditions. And so if you talk about what does a city look like in the future, it will be in an informal settlement type characteristic. And that's something which is also a little bit of a myth, because we think of future cities and we think of flying cars and we think of all these imagery which we're so used to. And so I thought that was an interesting field to explore.
And so I noticed you do a lot of things in housing, alternative housing, prototypes, 4 kinds of alternative housings, also in terms of upgrades. Tell me a bit about how that then factors into a lot of this and what the benefits are for, I guess, improving or advancing the design thinking in this field?
Yeah, so I think with housing, it's incredibly interesting because it's not just the house itself. We like to think of it as a habitation. And so it's not an apartment that we're building and trying to configure the best apartment. It's trying to configure the best apartment with open spaces, with access to urban services, with mobility, with schooling, with and all of the other systems which come into play there. And I think that holistic perspective on developing cities also comes down to the very fundamental question of what do you do with the land. And when you start to have those questions, you obviously have to bring in specialists who actually understand what happens with water, with energy, with economics. And then it gets very interesting. It gets very complicated, but you're no longer dealing in apartment. You're not designing an apartment anymore. You are designing housing, which is a habitation, and it contributes to the whole functioning of a city. So you're playing a big role in that if you're dealing more than just designing a house.
And that question of perspective is really encouraging us to stop looking at a single unit or single house as its own entity, but as part of a much larger, complex network of interactions.
Indeed, yeah. I think that's the point. And I think when you open that perspective up, you realize it's so complicated, you cannot do that alone. The architect cannot do it alone. He needs to have input from specialists. And that's the most interesting part. You can actually expand what the built environment is if you go beyond thinking that you are just an architect, which I've never identified myself with being just the architect.
Which is actually very interesting because in a way, I don't identify myself necessarily as an engineer at core. I find, yes, that's my training, but I try to expand my experience, my understanding across different disciplines because it's also about understanding the thinking of other disciplines. And I think what you've told me so far about your experience also really shows that you yourself are really interested in seeing how other people think, how other disciplines think, and how other disciplines, I guess, perceive design.
Yes, I think that's, again, coming down to the idea if we can design something ourselves and we can share it amongst ourselves as designers and we can get very clear feedback on how good it is and we can be satisfied with that, or we could say, well, maybe we're speaking to the wrong people. And I think if we consider design to be a process which doesn't just finish with the product, it's something which is continuous, then I think it has to bring in other fields of knowledge and other expertise. So it comes into a kind of a design thinking way, which most people are creative if you give them a chance. And I think then combining creativities, you have a kind of a chance for collective design intelligence.
I like that. I like the way you've phrased that. And this also brings back memories of how we first met. You actually approached me and my colleague to participate in a design competition in the city of Bern. It's called the Gaswerk Areal. For listeners who are interested, we will have some information in the show notes so that you can look up a bit more about the project and the work that we undertook together. To me, it was a very exciting opportunity because, like I said, aspiring architect, but never able to draw. I wanted to get a sense of how it feels to work together across these two disciplines because at its simplest level, you guys make very nice pictures, I must say. And it's something in 1,000 years, I never thought I'd be able to do, but somehow I feel like I was able to learn and contribute to that experience. But it might be good to hear from your angle what your experience with the Gaswerk was and what motivated you. I think we've heard a lot of that, but what motivated you to then approach us, myself and my colleague, to seek out our expertise in particular for those listening in the areas of urban water management, urban biodiversity, urban heat.
So these competitions are set up in a way that the architect and landscape architect are the main protagonists of the design. And what we wanted to do in this case was, because we were dealing with an area of such a size and such a scale, and we believe such an importance in the whole constellation of the territory of Bern, it needed an expertise which thought at a higher scale, a more complex level. Still dealing with the systems we are interested in, because the Gaswerk lies on a floodplain right on the River Aare. And that for us meant that we could step back for a second as architects and planners and just see what the experts who were yourselves and Julia, who were proposing that this site fits in with the whole system around Bern. And we were happy to then take a step back and learn firstly from your perspective before we even started to plan anything. I think that's also taking away the center of architecture or the center of thought from architecture. And we reached out not even knowing what your reaction would be. I remember having the first Skype meeting thinking, they're thinking, what do we want from them, right? And I was expecting at the end of the Skype meeting that you'd say, guys, what's in it for us? Or whatever, And both you and Julia were incredibly enthusiastic. And this led on to, a lot of meetings and a lot of sessions where we would think about how we could best approach the site. But as I said, working parallel at the eye level together with you guys allowed us to take a step back from just going in there and planning streets and housing and the whole which is what was expected. So it was incredibly a fresh project, and the start point was really let's just do this together and see where we end up.
For us, it was a very interesting opportunity to see how the science we've been developing, the actionable knowledge that, or at least we perceive as actionable knowledge, could help practice in actually creating an outcome that was desirable or that matched what we saw our work tell us as a message, as the overarching message. And so we were totally interested when you came to us, because it was a chance to really involve ourselves in the Swiss context, seeing any work that we had done already in Switzerland, how well it applies and transfers to other places in Switzerland. And so from what I remember is we would do a lot of the modeling, a lot of the pre-assessment, which would then generate lots and lots of data and information, and then pass that on to you through interpretation and discussion for you to figure out how can we create some kind of solution out of that. How did it feel encountering the kinds of maps, the kinds of measurements, not measurements, but model results that we gave you over time as the project progressed?
Firstly, they're very beautiful in a way. I mean, I like this aesthetic, actually. It's the scientist aesthetic. We had to apply some color corrections afterwards, but in general, the shape of those maps, and when you can see, I mean, the heat maps you were generating, the water flow maps, the flooding maps, the movement of species maps, these were like really fascinating because they also showed us something completely different. We don't use those tools. We usually use the cadastre plan, we use the kind of tree plans, but they're not dynamic. They don't show us anything but a static shape or geometry. So to work with these representations of dynamic movement on the site changes how we think of the site, basically. And it really made us think about, let's not just propose a solution, but let's propose a program. And the idea was that then we reduced all of our building footprint to a very small portion of the site, 11% of the site, and we fitted in the 60,000 square meters of building we had to push in that shape. And then we allowed that the rest of the area to be flooded. We allowed the natural cycles to have free reign, so to speak. And so this then would play out over the course of 50 years, we were considering. And it was also part of the whole bioremediation process where we were using special plant species to clean the polluted earth over a program of 30, 40, 50 years. So the whole design became a dynamic design, but it was based on the conversations we were having with you and the type of data and maps you were presenting us.
Just to clarify for our listeners, I believe the Gaswerk areal, the space we had, was around 3 hectares of land that we had to work with, on basically a lot of it on the floodplain, but a certain portion of it up on top at a much higher elevation.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, okay.
So that was also part of the concept. We had a flood level and we had a city level, and that was our proposition for ordering the rest of the built environment. But we said no streets, no sealed surfaces. The surfaces we had were permeable, thanks to your decisions. And then the whole water management and the flood management would then be ordered around those very small footprints of building that we would put together.
And that we would use the water or the natural flows of the river and the high levels of water that come in every now and then to help support the local biodiversity, to flood the areas that we know are rich for or suitable habitats for the current flora and fauna in the area.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, it's a myth, which is that we have to defend cities from water. And generally we do because they're badly planned. But having the chance to plan a different type of city down there with you guys, it was that, no, let's let that natural cycle happen. And actually, like you said, it brings in the nutrients. It helps actually revitalize the vegetation. And that's a natural cycle, and it needs these natural cycles. And that's something which, for a planner or an architect, is counterintuitive. So it was very fascinating on that level.
I guess it comes back to this design for humans versus, well, are humans really the only living species on Earth that we should be designing for? And one term that always came up throughout this experience in working with you on this project was this idea of cohabitation. And I've seen this word used quite a lot by many architects that I spoke with thereafter. And it seems to be a very big emerging topic, even though it's already been talked about or philosophized over the last decade or so. I remember 2 particular works that I read, one from Rosie Braidotti and Donna Haraway, who touched upon this topic. I think the alternative term they've used is also coexistence, or this idea of a post-human ecology. And to what extent did the push for that, or that the momentum that this kind of philosophy is gaining in architecture, To what extent was that really fulfilled in that design, in your opinion, or to what extent did you feel you embraced it?
I think it was a work in progress, and it was definitely a first stab at it. But for us to start thinking about the movements of lizards, I don't know, what are they called? These little
amphibians.
Oh, right. Exactly. No, I think it was
You could probably do movements of lizards as well. I guess in the biodiversity assessment, you choose your species, you try and find the data, and then you do the analysis.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Okay, no, I think I see the design that we put together as a first trial, and it was definitely something new to us. So we didn't capture everything that we wanted to do, but for us, for a moment, to start thinking about how an amphibian would be using the site, or that an amphibian or a bird species was an actor in this whole site, was something very new. And this ties back to your comment before where you talk about existing. We've always been thinking about designing cities for living together, but the question now is, and in the future, how will we exist together? And this has come about by a changing environment and a need for us to change our perspective on, again, this human-centered approach to habitat making, to building the environment. What's interesting is that this is not a new theme. I think in architecture, it's something which is, I would say, marginal, but trending. I remember reading something recently about the first Earth Summit in 1972. Since that time, 60% of the species have become extinct. And when we talk about coexistence, this theme was already present back in the 70s. It was something that was new, but it was present. That causes a little bit of an alarm. And I think that this theme should be then really on the agenda of every professional who's working in the built environment or analyzing or studying the built environment.
And I think this theme is starting to become quite apparent also in the decision makers in the city itself, because from when we attended the vernissage at the end of the competition, we did notice that the city got, I'd like to always call it as confused, not knowing what to do with the design because it was so radically different. And I personally think that's always a nice thing because you're challenging the current mindsets that we have, and not just within our own disciplines, but also across disciplines in the governance, in the decision making, but also just generally in the general livability perception or the mindset of the people that are going to be in the site and using the site.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been nice to have won that competition, but unfortunately we came fifth.
And I still think it's great.
It's great. What else? For an outlying idea. And I think the conversations we had and with the building directors and the jury directors were basically saying, we didn't know what to do with your proposal, but we had to keep it until the end round. And it was such that all the other propositions basically had variations of the similar form and volume, which was asked for in the brief. It was only our proposal who said, hey, 10% of the site is built form. The rest is something to negotiate. And I think that's something, hopefully, it has affected someone's thoughts throughout the process or it's been published in a way that people can pick up on that and take it forward.
One aspect about the design, and so, yeah, we'll show some links to the actual design so that listeners can then look up what it actually looks like. And again, I said, your renderings are amazing, and it just shows me that, it's been absolutely wonderful to work with you on this because you really see how the analysis you do on a computer really factors in as the final product. But one aspect that I wanted to touch upon, because it's something that in a way came about in a discussion that we weren't, I think we were busy that week, but this was the footbridge. You planned a footbridge across the entire site so that visitors to the site or people living there can traverse the entire site, safe for flooding from the one hand, but also quite separate from nature. And you rendered it with this wild nature beneath this bridge. What was the motivation behind that? And the reason I bring this up is because I remember we presented this to some architecture students, and it actually evoked a very strong discussion about cohabitation. Essentially, are we separating humans from animals by doing this, by putting in this kind of solution? Or is it actually a means towards realizing that we don't just own the land? We're not just the stewards of the land, or we shouldn't call ourselves the stewards of the land. I think this is, I might be misquoting, but I read this in John Gray's Straw Dogs about this stewardship aspect.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which is very difficult to resolve. And I think in general, we are becoming aware that the human species shares the same characteristics as other animals. the idea that consciousness may not be the highest good, may not be an excuse for extracting ourselves from the world. And I think that's something that we are starting to become aware of. But at the same time, there are certain needs that certain species have, and those needs don't always correspond nicely with each other. And I remember the conversation we had with the students there was, we made a couple of very simple moves to allow as much room on the site for any species to work with. You don't have to walk on the bridge. You could put on gumboots, or you could walk naked through the forest and be at one with every animal who you come across. It's also very possible. But on the other hand, you probably wouldn't be happy for that to happen in your own bedroom. You wouldn't want a fox to suddenly just walk past your bed. So there is a need for a curation and a designed curation of habitation, because there are different needs and vulnerabilities. So that bridge was, I mean, even for us, we didn't know if it was right? I think we said it was a very beautiful element, but is it right? And in this case, I would say yes, because that deals particularly with the human need. And the rest of the site also deals with human needs. It also deals with other species' needs by not forcing them to cross the human path, because most animals, rightly so, are scared of humans, right?
Mm-hmm. I remember animals would run away, or they would attack, not because they are trying to search for food, but just generally because it's a defense mechanism, the fight or flight response, which is inherent in all of us, not just in humans, but also in animals. Mm-hmm. It was definitely a very interesting conversation that it evoked. And yeah, most certainly you had in your design staircases that led down into the wild nature while maintaining some of the key monuments on site as well and embedding it in the nature. So I can certainly see that sometimes you need to take that extreme approach to acknowledging that there is a certain dichotomy at the moment in the mindset between humans and species. I seem to hear a lot of us talking about us versus them, and hopefully over time have it evolve towards we're all together.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult topic, because if it was up to other animals, they wouldn't want to coexist with humans. And I think that's something we also have to come to terms with. When we talk about coexistence, we are assuming that other animals also want to coexist. And if we weren't acting as stewards of the land or of Mother Nature, or however you would like, then perhaps we wouldn't even consider coexistence. So there's a lot of issues which we have to deal with. And I think it's outside of Western thought to comprehend these. I think maybe it's Indian thought or Buddhist philosophy which will help us out here. Again, it's not a new field, and many thinkers have gone there and have some really interesting results. But I think, again, it's that problem of saying, how do we all coexist harmoniously? And that's never going to happen. There's always going to be conflict, and there will always be species which are dominant at one period and not dominant at the next. And the human beings will eventually not be the most dominant species. It's nature, as you will probably make sure that will happen in a sense.
And this evokes a lot of the messages I've read in Rosie Braidotti's essay on coexistence. So for those interested, we can definitely put a link to the reference so that you can look it up as well. Definitely a very interesting, insightful read. Generally, I think the project itself as an experiment, and you love experimentation, I think it has been quite a great learning process, and you've been trying to take that on board in future projects that you've been doing. Looking forward to seeing what comes up next, and when we will do another extreme, radical kind of transformation of an urban space and see what happens, what kind of thoughts and reactions we can provoke as a result of that.
Yeah, any time. I think anyway we have some projects coming up, so there's chance there.
Will be super cool. Mm-hmm. But where do you think we're going with the whole cohabitation philosophy? Do you think it's here to stay? It's going to be shaped as something even more profound? Or do you think, as you said, it's a trend just now? Is it just going to go away after a few years? Will we become complacent?
Yeah, I mean, there is a danger of that, and I probably would bet more towards that there are, as I said before, there are many very insightful movements which have repositioned how we are running economies or how we are dealing with the environment, but they tend to get forgotten and other themes come up. And this is a characteristic of being human, I think. The momentum is difficult to kind of continue, especially when cultures are so different and they have different expectations. So a global movement on cohabitation most likely won't happen. A global movement on environmental action collectively probably also won't happen. I mean, these are things which we can assume if we look at history carefully. We know that the issue we're in right now doesn't really have any fixes, and therefore we have to work differently, or we have to at least be positive about the efforts we are making. I think there was from the philosopher Gramsci, he was talking about being positive in the outlook, but pessimistic in our understanding. And I think that's where I am now. I think it's a healthy position to be in.
I guess it's a cautionary position to be in. It also sounds a bit scary when you think about it, because it's this, oh my God, we're all doomed kind of perception, which maybe is not as extreme as it sounds. But I think collaboration is one of the key aspects, and maybe not as a whole global collective, but wherever we can find it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there is a way of collective motivation, which I think can come to some very pleasing results. And I think that's a cross-cultural ambition. I don't think the human motivation is to be isolated and individual. I believe that there are other motivations which are fired by working on things together, working things out together. And I think for design and for more complex projects at larger scales, that's the only way to go forward. Whether they come to the results that we want them to come to, and if they come to those results quick enough, that's another thing.
That's true. And I think it's also getting in touch with the people and being receptive towards different styles of thinking, different philosophies of thinking, and being able to communicate with the means we have, such as myself communicating with the maps and the analyses, and yourself communicating with the art and the drawings, but also that dialogue, which I think is super important.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about that as design and dialogue, where the design is not something which is given and not something which is produced by the single author. It's something which is worked on and adapted. It needs a core idea, and it needs a strong central premise, I think, for it to motivate people and for it to be perceivable. But then it should be shaped and adapted to fit the real world, because design is always done in theory until it gets practiced, until it gets built, or until it gets tested. And that's why I think what's most interesting about the work that you're doing is you're allowing one step of that whole design process to be tested before it actually goes into production. So your analysis and the feedback we get from your analysis helps us build design methods which are using evidence to develop into something which could then be built and then lived in.
We talk a lot about evidence-based knowledge, using the science. I see two different pathways that I guess design takes, or at least I've observed them. One being design by narrative, and the other one being data-driven design or design by evidence. Do you think there's similarities there? Do you think there's a very fundamental difference, maybe even preference towards where we should be going? Or is it maybe a combination of the two that is the sweet spot?
So design by narrative, meaning that it's built on a vision, on an intuitive, on intuition.
Vision, intuition, I guess historical incidents, understanding the story that has happened thus far and where the story should go.
Yeah, I think the sweet spot is somewhere, as you said, it's between the idea of building a narrative around the data as well. Architecture is using narrative a lot to frame a solution. It doesn't use data so much, at least it is starting now to be able to use data to improve the design or to shape a narrative in a different way. But I think with our project at Gaswork again, and some of the other stuff we've been doing with you, is about building a narrative around the data to say, this is what we are reading. It fits our hypotheses, or it has shaped our new hypotheses. And this is something quite compelling, because we are not just being creators, we're not just being authors of a design, we're actually allowing the feedback we're getting from the environment to affect that narrative and that design.
And I guess that narrative, as we talked about much earlier, is more than just the unit of parcel or the unit of apartment you're designing, but has to fit within the broader story of the regional environment.
Yeah, and I guess then it's a matter of saying, which person or which data are you collecting and who is collecting that data in order to be analyzed. They all have their own narratives, I guess, right? Unless you and in your work, you can start to synthesize various data together to create new narratives or fresh narratives that we didn't even think about before. So that's what I like, the potential about the collaboration exploration is that we can find new ways of synthesizing various data sets to create new narratives. And I think that's probably the most important thing. Maybe we have to design far later and just grab a lot of different data, and data qualitative or quantitative, and then feel out a narrative. And maybe it's not even just us who is defining the narrative. We can open that up a little bit. And there we're going somewhere interesting. Then it's not just about an architect trying to fit their design into your narrative or you building your narrative over the design. It's really saying, let's let the narrative emerge somehow.
Emergent kind of design. I like the sound of that. And it really is a testament to what both disciplines are strong in and what they can bring to merge together. And often the outcome is much bigger than just the sum of parts.
Yeah, and the outcome is always something which in the end has to be built or has to be executed in a way. Of course, we can finish a design and publish it and communicate it and we'd be also satisfied with that to a level. But in the end, everything is reduced to form, and the form is something which stands. And the irony there is that the architect used to consider the building as the endpoint to their work. But that's actually the highest point of when the architecture is at its most pristine, it then starts to disintegrate. Whereas with Gaswerk, it was the other way around, or with other landscape projects we're doing, it's the other way around. You start with the worst case because it's just kind of ugly. You just build it, you transform the earth. Then it starts to grow and shape and develop and become beautiful.
Very fascinating. We've talked a lot about Gaswerk, about this concept of cohabitation. And I think we're still all testing the waters and trying to build that mutual understanding of what it really means. You did a project in Nepal, which I think is very insightful and very interesting. And it also, I think, in particular, looks at recovering from disasters or securing, managing disaster risk, which is something, perhaps with floods we don't see, or we see the flooded areas, but with things like earthquakes, which can really wreak havoc and damage to the fundamental building structures if not designed properly. We obviously need some solutions around these kinds of aspects. Tell me a bit about the experience you had with this project in Nepal, because I remember you said it was quite an interesting and an eye-opening experience for you.
The Nepal project was very interesting because it also showed us the conflict between policy and the real world. And that is that in the late 80s, the valley in which we were working with got registered as World Heritage. And as a World Heritage area, the people who were living there were not allowed to cut down trees anymore because everything was protected. And this move to create a World Heritage area in the valley basically destroyed the architectural culture because the buildings needed large timber elements to construct secure housing. So the result of that was that the residents had to build housing without large timber elements. They had to put together the houses with the stone they were using and piecing it together with whatever they could find as structural elements. So when the earthquake did hit, this caused a destruction of something to the degree of 90% of the housing in the valley. Wow. And basically because the houses weren't built properly. They could have been built properly, but they weren't because the people had no longer access to the trees around the valley. And to get any trees or large-scale timber elements from the lower cities takes 2 or 3 days of the Sherpa communities carrying those up by themselves or paying thousands of dollars for a helicopter to bring them up.
Oh, wow.
So what we did was we analyzed the timber trading network. We were able to find out from those who were building houses what their problems and deficits were. We went to site and were able to show the locals what was happening. We were doing shake table tests, like model tests, which would then simulate earthquakes and simulate the earthquakes with a structural system which we thought would be appropriate, using small timber elements but tied together in a frame between the stones, and then what it would be without that. And so it became very clear that just using what was locally available, but just configuring it in a different way, using a secondary element of galvanized steel cord, we were able to provide a prototype for how we could secure the structures on any of those buildings. So basically it was a scalable prototype which we built and tested for a monk's dormitory in the Tama Valley.
Okay, so those, retrofit kind of solutions or flexible design kind of solutions that you can then implement in a very rapid way in the case of these kinds of unexpected events.
Yeah, it was more like a design system, and we showed how the design system worked. We did the documentation, and we allowed as many people as possible to come to the site while we were constructing that with the local contractors and the monks. And we chose the monks' dormitory out of that 90% of the buildings which were destructed because it was the people's choice. They felt very uncomfortable to see the monks in the valley, not on the hillside, but to see them eating and showering. And this is something which really turned the whole culture on its head. This was not meant to happen, to see the monks outside of their dormitory. So it was the choice of the community to start with that building, to build a prototype which they could learn from, and then to roll that over into the other civic buildings and then private buildings, going from the public into going from the religious to the public into the private.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. Also the way the community comes together and in a way makes that collective decision, takes that collective action.
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating to see. I mean, we had one of us on site for the whole construction time. Actually, two of us were on site for the whole construction time. The others were in Zurich helping build the models and designing it. And we connected through a very strong internet connection to the top of the Tama Valley in the Himalayas, where the picture was perfect. The streaming was like impeccable. We could see the monks. We could hear the chipping of the stone in the studio in Zurich. And what's fascinating about that was that one of us gave us the report to say that when they first got to the site, there was a small monk. He was 7 years old. He couldn't speak any Hindi at the time. But after 3 months, he went back again, and this small monk could then speak pretty much fluid Hindi. And he thought, well, how did that happen? And they said that he was watching the cartoon channel in Hindi, right? And so this is something, again, it's a little bit of a change of myth where you assume the monks do certain things and they have certain ways of working. And this opened up a lot of different possibilities for us to think, well, we're connecting live to a building site in the Himalayas, helping the design, communicating with the contractor, and a very interesting project.
And where's that project now? Like, have they learned a lot from that prototyping experience, from that flexible design experience?
Straight after the monks' dormitory was built, there is now 2 projects going on. One is a school, which is for, I think, 30 children in the valley, and a community center, which is being planned right now. So we're kind of following that from a distance at the moment. We went in there, worked very closely with the local contractors in the community and the NGO, which represented the valley. But at that point, we say, this is what we can do. This is our contribution. We hope it helps. And then we step back, and whatever sticks or whatever goes forward becomes part of an adjusted building culture. Hopefully it can help. If not, then we tried.
Any signs of cohabitation design in that project? Or are we're getting there slowly?
Well, I mean, that's interesting because like the original Nepalese house in this valley was actually a stall. It's a classical building, farmhouse, right? It's the stall underneath where the animals stay, and upstairs is basically the domestic habitation. That's the typical domestic house. And we weren't able to build one of those ones. We were building always the public because we don't want to go and build a private house and then have all the problems with favoritism in the community. So we built a system which can be adapted. But that's also, a fascinating typology where this coexistence, where animals and humans are sleeping in the same house and protected by the weather in the same house. Also, the transfer of heat is beneficial. And that's, I guess, a far more conducive cohabitation existence, which has been happening for thousands of years. I think only the time when we have industrial agriculture, we start to break that idea of cohabitation is nothing new. It was actually far better resolved modern pre-industrial times.
Yeah, I think that observation is also a bit of an encouragement for us to go and look at how things used to be, or how other cultures have been doing it and are still doing it. So maybe something to take inspiration from for future design as well. The project in Nepal, and I think a lot of the things we've learned from it are very interesting, insightful, and gives us, in a way, hope, but also lots of, motivation, I think, to test out these ideas in different cultures, and as well as in Switzerland as well, perhaps in the future. And You are now based in a studio or research group or union. You tell me what you want to call it, called 10. You co-founded this in what year was it?
2016.
You co-founded 10 in 2016. You are now based there. What was the story that led up to that?
Well, I think 10 started off as an event. It was an event to build a pavilion in Skopje. And from there, I think it transformed into a desire to work together, and it became an organization, fairly loose at the start, but then it was consolidated into a statute for which a rather long editing process happened, where everybody would contribute to this statute, which would be the guiding principles of how these people who came together rather randomly, but generally through the ETH, would work together and work on other projects like this first project, because it's something that we thought was missing in the architecture school at the time. I know it's changed a lot now, but at the time, none of the professors were talking to each other. There was always this very isolated and rather provincial kind of intellectual silos. And I think this was something that we didn't understand. And we were working together because we were all research scientists or studio leaders. There was about 8 of us, I think, at the time. And we were always talking together. We were sharing ideas together. We were thinking about future architecture propositions together. And we thought that was very powerful. Even though we were working for professors who were in completely different worlds than each other, we were able to bridge those dogmas. And that created the foundation of 10. And I think since then, we've always pursued this type of dialogue in how we develop projects. It's come to the point now where we're becoming recognized as a group, as a platform of architects, but also extending that to all the collaborators who work with 10. And it's very exciting to have a kind of recognition that this type of collaboration or this kind of collective design intelligence is desired and actually needed. And I think this has given us chances to present our work on some of the leading platforms globally and to be invited to talk about how we work, and also to produce work from invited competitions, which have allowed us to put that design thinking into a form, into a proposal. And that's something which we're all very excited about. But coming back to the statute, it is a running project. How to make sure the group stays coherent, how we can still run and share together without being too project focused and basically turn into a normal architecture office. That's basically the biggest project, is to make sure we don't lose that spirit and that ambition, and keep sharing, keep finding new ways of approaching design, and keep building new collaborations with people we don't really understand. And I think was actually one of the reasons I reached out to you guys, because we don't understand really what you do, but we know it's important.
It's lovely to hear. And I like the idea of having or treating the group not as a company or a studio, but as an evolving narrative, if we want to use that word. How you can build that collaboration, you can innovate in the design, and you can deliver some actual impact in the projects you do as well. And for listeners who want to know a bit more about 10 Studio, you can go to the website. It's 10.studio, and you have a whole portfolio of all the different projects you've done. I myself have looked at it, and it's a whole range of many different projects, from small to large, but also, from simple to really grand ones that I think you've also exhibited at the Biennales and the Triennales. So super, super fascinating. This has been a great and insightful conversation so far, and I would love to ask you a few questions, simple ones for which can offer some advice to listeners and to also people who are aspiring to do what you do in future. And I guess one of the first ones is, we have these moments where we read a book, or we've read a paper, we attended a seminar, we met one particular person or a few people who have really changed our mindset, our thinking. What kinds of examples can you offer there that has really impacted you?
I mean, I'd like to give a really precise answer on this one, but I find that because I read very widely, and I think I come across literature or I see an exhibition, or I see a particular group or designer who is doing something that I find particularly moving, it stays in my mind and it shapes then how I'm thinking. But I don't really have any particular moments or any particular characters. I think it would be almost unfair, because there's been so many different disciplines which I've looked into and drawn inspiration from. I would have to be able to list all this down at one point, but I kind of feel like the more broader motivation, or the more broader thoughts that are shaping how I approach things are more of the philosophers. And I think it's reading from Schopenhauer to John Gray but also then literature from Joseph Conrad or more of a contemporary writers is something which shapes maybe the motivation. But then when it comes down to the production or the design, that's something which happens quite fleetingly, I'd say.
Quite organically, fleetingly. And yeah, I guess sometimes it's hard to pinpoint because it's often the collective reading or the collective dialogue we've engaged in that really creates that change in our perception.
Yeah, and I think when you read something or you see an exhibition or you see a piece of architecture or a moment in a city, a lot of those things perhaps weren't even the intention of the producer or the creator, but I have an affiliation with them. A lot of them are anonymous architects who have built something in a city, which I find incredibly fascinating. I don't know who did it or why I even like it. So I think I would leave it at that. I think walking through cities, being in different countries, coming across certain moments in cities or finding an exhibition or an art piece, or that's it all flows into the bigger pool of inspiration.
That is true. Although you and I are currently reading a book at the same time, it just so happens, The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I think you're a bit further ahead than me, but I think both of us do agree that it's been quite an interesting take on what the world might look like as we're combating climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to know where it goes. It was recommended by Obama, so it probably has a happy ending. I don't know.
I guess we'll say, does climate change have a happy ending? Hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, the genre is very interesting, this eco-fiction, which is a new term for me. And I think it's quite interesting to play that off the data which says, no, it's fact. It's going to happen. And this is not set too far in the future. And the stories it's showing right now, and again, I'm halfway through, you're probably a third.
Probably, yeah, about a third. I need to get onto it.
It's basically telling us the stories we kind of know, which is really frustrating because there's no heroes in this book.
No, I would totally agree. I think we are all the heroes and the villains at the same time. At least that's the perception I'm getting as I'm starting to progress through the book a bit more. And I guess one other aspect, which I think is also nice when we always catch up, one thing which I think is always very quirky about interacting with you is that you are a foodie. And we always try and pick a new restaurant in Zurich, and it seems to always end up being an Asian place. Do you take a lot of that inspiration and just that motivation from, doing your design, being shaped by your experience across the world, and then coming back to a good stir fry, a good Asian meal?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think there's something edgy about the Asian kitchen, which I think I haven't been able to understand completely. I try to look as many recipes as possible in this. It's so varied. I mean, but the experience I had in China was that even the Chinese kitchen, you'd never fully understand it. It's so rich, from the heavy and the long baked stews in the north to the really light and spicy works like that down in Sichuan. And this is something which can completely open up an experience of eating, which we usually just take for granted. It's sustenance, but it's actually incredibly entertaining and incredibly inspiring to know that you got to cut a vegetable in a certain way, or you've got to marinate something for a certain period of time, or there is thousands of different peppers and each one has its own characteristic. And I think this comes into being curious and I guess building a knowledge, and when you know, and so you enjoy food when you know what it does and what it is.
And it's your experimentation, not just in the design studio, but also in the kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
What are some strategies that you can offer in terms of time management? How do you balance your design and your personal life? What are some key aspects that you set for yourself? Because I see you sometimes in the design studio when the project is due and you're working late hours. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I don't think I have a good way of managing yet. I mean, I think we, as architects, architects dealing with projects under these timelines, there is an insistence that the work we hand in has to be rather perfect. And we have very high standards in our group. And I think this causes everybody to be very motivated and dedicated to handing in something which we think can not only speak for the brief, but also speak for how we approach our work. So the last 2 weeks, they're always going to be rather chaotic and too much work, and we regret it. But then when we hand the work in, we say, no, this is good. We needed to come to this level. But then after, we have the luxury of having projects which require design thinking, ideation, and this period of time, it gives a lot of energy because you get to throw ideas around, you explore, and that can be done in a time scale which we define. Basically, the more pressure we want to take off the production, the smaller this ideation or creation part is, but we like to expand that as far as possible. And then, so it's always going to be a bit of a stress at the end, I think.
I find that very interesting. So there's, in a way, it's this accepting that you will have these periods of ridiculous time pressure, but knowing that, first of all, the satisfaction of handing something in that you feel is as perfect as you can make it, followed by this quieter period where I guess, first of all, you can then devote it to your own interests and your own personal life, but also this exact design ideation phase that you feel you need to have as long as possible for the creative thinking. I think that's, in a way, something you accept and you just have to abide by and act self-discipline to work through it.
Yeah, and I think if it was the other way around, it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be like you quickly come up with an idea, whatever it is, and then spend a lot of time just producing it, because I think you may miss the potential of what you're doing there. So I think, it's like any creative field which has these moments, whether it's also the theater where you go and present something, but you build up towards this moment. And then when building, you have a similar situation where when you hand in the documents and construction starts, of course, there is a moment when things are automatic, but then the pressure builds up on every phase of that construction. But I like that. I like this idea of having intense moments and then having moments of repose. And I think without that, I wouldn't know what kind of a daily life I would lead. If I was in a nondescript corporate office where things are rather regular, I would find that difficult to fulfill.
Reminds me of the saying, never a dull moment. If it was all too optimized, perhaps it would be all too monotonous. But I guess it's all about excitement. Creativity requires this sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. It requires some extremes.
Yeah, no, very true. What was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career, and how did you overcome it?
I think a number of different situations come up when you're working in environments which are very unfamiliar to yourself. While in China, I was curating a biennale at the National Museum, and things like very basic ideas about time and finances weren't understood at all throughout the whole project ever. So these situations cause moments of complete despair, and you really have to reflect on how you were working until that time, because everything you thought was understood was not understood. This happens also in South Africa while working there on a larger urban scale projects. And those are just moments where not only you don't speak the same language, you don't use the same tools as the experts you're dealing with, and they just cause these situations where you have to build bridges very, very quickly, and you have to be very, very creative, and you have these crises meetings and you all come together, and if the environment is positive, you'll work something out. And there's been a couple of moments, I can't be too specific, but a couple of moments when there are these crises meetings when all the people come together, and you have to run those meetings like they are workshops. It's like this crisis is a workshop. That's been okay.
And I guess showing vulnerability, transparency, and just openness to say, hey, we're in this situation. We need to figure it out. Now's not the time to argue about it, and let's try and work it through.
Yeah, exactly.
So what advice can you offer to young aspiring architects who are starting out, or young aspiring planners who would like to go into the field that you're in, myself being one of them, maybe?
Yeah, no, I think stick to it. I think the idea that architecture or urban design or urban studies is pre-given is wrong. And I think when you go into the field, you can develop your own niche, and you can invent how you shape that discipline and who you work with and the type of work you do. It's all possible, but you have to be reflective and be able to take some risks. And I think most people would say, I don't really want to go and work in an office. So invent the office that you want, or invent the studio that you want. It won't happen straight away. It won't work straight away, but you got to find ways to do it, because the people we look to now who are inspiring are treading a different course. And it was their volition which created that course.
And you have your own story to tell and your own story to shape. So in a way, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to make sure, of course, that you are offering value. That's probably the critical thing. If you can do your own story and no one is listening because, well, maybe you're talking to yourself, or you haven't looked far enough to find out where your story is relevant, or you're not communicating in a way where people find it relevant. So that's also part of the whole the advice. Understand what you're doing, what your passions are, and find the language to be able to communicate them in a way.
I guess the saying goes, the world is your oyster.
Could be. I don't understand that saying, actually. What is your oyster? It means, what does it mean? It means that there's a...
I don't know, like the world is... This is embarrassing.
It's yours.
I know, it's me. No, the world is your oyster. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, go out there. You can make of it what you would like, and work hard and do stuff with it. I really should look up that saying. Hey, and that's the interesting thing. We sometimes come up with sayings and we take it at face value, and maybe sometimes when you start to think deeper about it, you actually realize, hang on, what is the real interpretation of it? And I think that's what's fascinating about these kinds of little sayings and anecdotes, that you sometimes just take for granted and you say it out loud, but then when it comes to really explaining it, then you start to notice and you start to think deeper.
Yeah, I mean, Heidegger was saying, when the hammer breaks, you peer into reality. When your saying doesn't work, you realize, what does it actually mean? And then this module which you've been used to using maybe doesn't work anymore. So it's kind of cool.
That's definitely homework for us to try and revisit any sayings that we frequently use and see what the actual meaning behind it is. And maybe we've been misusing them and misquoting them all along.
That's a good project. I think maybe we listen to the podcast again and I'll find some that I use.
I am sure in retrospect. But Scott, it has been absolutely fascinating listening to your stories, talking to you, and discussing, what the future may hold in terms of architecture, cohabitation, as well as projects. I would have loved to cover a lot more, but I think that just means that we're going to have to do this again on another occasion to hear more about the adventures that you've been on. But where can people reach you if they would like to know a bit more about you?
Yeah, just contact us. Yeah, come to the website. It's 10.studio, or we have a Instagram page, which is 10 Studio. Yeah, any feedback is good to have, and the studio is open. We have an open studio basically, so you walk in. Don't disturb us when we're handing something in, but walk in general.
Well, I mean, it's very hard with the floors that keep creaking, but it's certainly a very wonderful studio. Well, we'll be heading there later, so it'll be nice to go there and see everyone again. But no, thank you very much, and thank you to you listeners for tuning in for this very fascinating conversation with Scott Lloyd. As I've done previously, I leave you the last word. Any final message that you would like listeners to take away?
Maybe action shapes theory as a ending note. Maybe in a sense that when you act and when you can actually test out what you're doing, you can make mistakes, you can learn from them, but at least you're also then showing what could be done better. I think that's probably the one little takeaway I could offer.
Thank you very much, Scott.
And thank you to you listeners for tuning in to this wide-ranging and fascinating conversation with Scott Lloyd. As mentioned, you can find links to projects, philosophers, and oysters, both literally and linguistically, in our show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. If you enjoyed this show and are looking forward to more episodes, please do subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you are listening from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. I would be incredibly grateful for this, as it helps me to reach a broader audience and, who knows, perhaps inspire a greater uptake and collection of philosophical ideas that can help us better argue for living with frogs and lizards, or helping communities build affordable and resilient housing. If you'd like to know more about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website at petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on Twitter at Peter M. Bach or Instagram at PeterMBach87. If you have feedback or suggestions, or just know someone who has an inspiring story to offer, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Bucolia by Bureaucratic. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.